to this panel discussion tonight about foreign reporting. And I'm David Coulier. I'm the director of the School of Journalism here at the U of A. It's my pleasure to have these incredible people here, and thank you for taking time to listen and hopefully ask questions of them, because that's important. We believe here in the School of Journalism that journalism is more important than ever, particularly when it comes to covering the world. And if journalists aren't out there doing it, how are we going to know what's going on? And it's a long tradition that's gone for decades at the school, led by amazing faculty, including our former director, Jacqueline Sharkey, who covered much of the world herself as a journalist, and many faculty in the audience. Thank you for coming. I also want to thank Sonia Fry from the Overseas Press Club and their generous support for helping make this happen. We really appreciate that. And if you're interested in more talks and more events that we put on, and you'd like to get notice of that, feel free to put your email address on a little clipboard that's going to pass around here. We just want to make sure that you're aware of things as they happen. We won't deluge you with spam, trust me. We don't do that. And I want to introduce our moderator for the weekend. It may seem like it goes that long, but yeah.
Did you bring a sandwich?
It may seem that long, but it probably won't. I think it'll fly by very fast. Bill Schmidt, who's a professor of practice here at the school, will be moderating the session. And Bill's an amazing journalist. He worked for the Detroit Free Press and then 8 years for Newsweek as a correspondent in Moscow and various places around the world, Cairo. Went on to the work at the New York Times for 32 years, where he was a foreign correspondent and bureau chief in London, covered the Middle East, Africa, the Balkans, you name it. And most recently retired as deputy managing editor just this last fall. And Bill, he knows the world and he knows journalism very well, and we're lucky to have him teaching our students. I wish I had that. In fact, I'm going to sit in on your classes. So Bill, thank you, and thanks all of you for coming.
Thank you all. Thank you, Dave, for those very, very generous remarks. And thank you as well for your vision and your support. And let me also add thank you for the work of your staff, including the indefatigable Kate Harrison. And Kate, you're worth all 6 of those syllables in that word. So for your help in putting this event together. You know, this panel today marks also, in a way, a kind of coming out event for a new center for global and frontier journalism within the School of Journalism, a center that we hope will partner not only with media professionals, but with scholars and academic departments across the campus, building on some important teaching initiatives that are already underway among our faculty at the school in Afghanistan, the Middle East, and along both sides of the border with Mexico. So stay tuned. I would also like to second Dave in thanking Sonia Fry for helping sponsor this event today and for the Overseas Press Club. And if I could also ask you, I'm back on now. Was I off? Okay, sorry. I'll stay closer to the microphone. If you could, I would also like, Sonia, if you could convey our gratitude to the people at the Ford Foundation for all of the terrific work and support that they offer to you and to other journalistic organizations so that we can have conversations like this about journalism. Over the last decade, in my role inside the Times, I watched firsthand as the pace of digital, economic, and global change reshaped the way journalists at the Times and elsewhere covered the world. This afternoon, I am joined by 3 distinguished colleagues from the world of journalism to talk about reporting across frontiers and about the perils and the new challenges that journalists and journalism itself must now confront in the digital age, in a world that has become faster, more complex, and far more dangerous for reporters. So let me introduce our panel right now. On my right is Ricardo Sandoval-Palos, whose career as a journalist has spanned 3 decades, including more than 8 years based in Mexico City as the Latin American correspondent for the Dallas Morning News and for Knight Ridder newspapers. Mr. Sandoval, who also served as an assistant city editor at the Sacramento Bee in California, has won a number of awards for his journalism, including an Overseas Press Club Award. He has also worked with the Center for Public Integrity and Human Rights Watch and is co-author of a 1997 book about Cesar Chavez and the farm workers movement. Next to him is Jania Sanini, who is among the most distinguished and successful in investigative journalists of her generation. Until recently, as investigative editor of La Nación in San Jose, Costa Rica, Ms. Sanini led a team of journalists whose work over the years has uncovered 10 separate cases of international corruption within her country, including separate bribery investigations that sent 2 former presidents of Costa Rica to jail. She teaches investigative journalism at the University of Costa Rica and has helped train hundreds of journalists around the globe in her craft. She is a winner of numerous prizes and awards and was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University. Finally, at the far end, I would like to introduce Mort Rosenblum, a professor of practice and colleague of mine in the School of Journalism. As a decorated foreign correspondent for the Associated Press, Mort, and here is an astounding fact, Mort has covered and filed stories from 200 countries, some of which, Mort will point out, no longer exist.
I had nothing to do with that, though.
Yeah, not his fault. He ran AP bureaus in Africa, Asia, South America, and Paris, where Mort and his wife Jeanette still reside part of the year. Among other honors, he is a recipient of an Overseas Press Club Award. That's 2 here. Yes, and I have an Overseas Press Club Award, so there's 3 out of 4. Among other honors, he's also an active blogger and commentator on the state of journalism, and he is the author of 12 books on topics ranging from foreign affairs to chocolate and olives. Those are 2 different books, right, Mort?
Those are the ones that sold.
Yeah. Okay. And by the way, Mort is also a native of Tucson and a graduate of the University of Arizona. Ladies and gentlemen, the panel. Before I turn to them and begin what I hope will be a passable imitation of Charlie Rose here, I would like to just share with you a bit of a preamble to help frame the agenda for this afternoon. And after our discussion, by the way, I will leave time for some questions from all of you. So at the heart of our discussion is a simple but essential truth. Journalism, at the end of the day, is about bearing witness. It's about reporters traveling into difficult places, sometimes crossing frontiers and borders, in order to help us illuminate the darker parts of our world. Without the independent witness that a reporter provides, without the work that journalists do on the ground, how else are we able truly to separate truth from rumor? But journalism is facing an existential crisis. Not only have serious news organizations had to rethink the scale of their enterprise because of the economic pressures that technological and market changes have forced on the industry, but the world itself has become far more perilous. The toll of journalists killed, missing, kidnapped, or arrested grows every year. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, 70 journalists were killed across the globe last year alone. 28 of those deaths were in Syria, where another 30 journalists, half of them Westerners, are currently missing and unaccounted for. In Mexico, 30 journalists have been killed, some in terrible ways, over the last 2 decades, including a journalist whose body was discovered just last week in Veracruz. Moreover, hundreds of journalists across the world have been imprisoned or forced to flee their countries for their own safety as the result of the actions of criminal cartels as well as governments that have a low tolerance for media scrutiny. Only last month in Egypt, just as a recent example, 3 journalists from the Gulf-based news organization Al Jazeera were jailed on charges of having links to a terrorist organization and spreading what the government called false news. These accusations have been condemned both by the US government and by international journalistic organizations. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, 5 journalists have been killed in Egypt alone and 44 imprisoned since the military there toppled the government of President Mohamed Morsi last summer. When journalists are unable to do their jobs because of violence or threats or intimidation or the fear of reprisal, I believe it has consequences for us all, everywhere, who depend on a free press as a guarantor of a free society. So, taking up that broad point, Rick, I'd like to begin close to home with you and ask you about your experiences in Mexico, which have been one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a journalist. The government of Enrique Peña Nieto, presumably in the interest of guaranteeing a free society, has pledged to take a firmer hand in prosecuting crimes against journalists. Has it made any difference? And are journalists there any safer, more protected today than they are in the past?
Wow. You know, I know the pledge, and it echoes a pledge from the previous administration in Mexico that they would take a firm hand and really go and do more than has ever been done to protect journalists at the federal level. But the funny thing is that not one case of an assault, not one kidnapping of a journalist, not one murder of a journalist has truly been solved in Mexico. I mean, you talk to people on the street and everybody has a theory as to who done it. Everybody except federal prosecutors. So I don't think that to date or to this moment we've seen much of a difference beyond just a different person saying what are essentially the same words. And that's on behalf of a courageous group of journalists who operate in a country that doesn't have a tradition that we have in the U.S. of holding journalists in a different light as we do here in the U.S. When I worked in Mexico and when I was a correspondent down there, I often got into some pretty interesting situations and dicey situations, but I always had this comfort, this sense of comfort that I was an American journalist, and that they would not try to do anything to me. And it was difficult to have conversations with my Mexican colleagues, because I would tell them that I'm troubled working with them, because sometimes I felt like I would get them into trouble for the stories that we would write. But my recourse was that I could get on a plane tomorrow and be back in the safety of the U.S. They have to stay there. They have to persist. So in a great way, I look at them as being infinitely more courageous than I, in even thinking that they can continue to do the kinds of stories that some of the media and some reporters down in Mexico continue to do. And I think it's a testament to the courage, and I'd like to say there's a testament to the training that a lot of us have been able to help journalists in Mexico with. And I'm still a little bit pessimistic that we're going to see any great change here in the future. Peña Nieto's administration is fairly young, so I'll give him and the administration a gracious benefit of the doubt, but I'm pessimistic, honestly.
The President Obama, I believe, is in Mexico today.
Right.
So,
right.
Are there places in Mexico that even now you will not go?
Yeah. No, I think that, when we're talking about conflict zones and area war zones, and you think about body counts and death tolls and so forth, and you see actions happening in concentrated places such as Syria, such as Afghanistan and Iraq. But think about this. In Ciudad Juarez, a couple of years ago, the murder rate, the murder count, was over 3,000. Over 3,000 people were murdered in Ciudad Juarez in 1 year. That surpasses the death toll for armed forces in Afghanistan. And then you think about the Mexico as a country and the regions in Central America and some of the other conflict zones in South America. In Mexico alone, there are over 100,000 people who have either been killed, injured, kidnapped, and in actions that are attributable to drug trafficking and other criminal and organized crime. So to have that kind of a statistic right across our border, to me, is indicative that there are places in Mexico that are just out of control. And if you ask even government officials and police authorities in Mexico in a quiet moment and perhaps off the record, they will admit that there are parts of Mexico that they are not the law. There are parts of Mexico that are actually run by local strongmen. Just as we have warlords that we all know about in Afghanistan, there are local drug traffickers, there are local organized crime leaders in parts of Mexico that rule those towns. And it's a tough place to be a journalist.
That's an interesting point. I mean, I think we've seen this in many other countries. You see it on the tribal frontier of Afghanistan and Pakistan, and other parts of Latin America. I think the border with Mexico and Guatemala, the area around Venezuela, where you have these kind of shadow lands that exist along the border that are almost stateless, and the people in charge are the cartels, or it's not the government that's in control.
Yeah. And it's interesting because you know, the U.S.-Mexico border, to me, and I'm from the border. I call myself a border rat. I mean, I was born in Tijuana, and when we immigrated to the U.S. and we made our big immigration as a family of 9 kids, we took the long trek to San Diego, 5 miles away. So it was a long migration pattern for us. But the thing was that I grew up on the border. My family is of the border, on both sides of the border. I grew up with my dentist and my doctor, and the weekly shopping trips were in Tijuana, not in San Diego, because for a lot of reasons. And you see the border change over time. And I can pinpoint right now for you that period in history, at least modern history, when our border has gone from a place of coexistence to this, I would say, a little bit more sinister apparatus. And by the way, I've never called it a physical border. One of these days in my utopian future, I'm going to have a radio show, and it's going to be called The Seam, where we talk about binational issues. And it's called The Seam because, to me, it's a seam. This is not a border. It's a seam. It's a stretch of land, 3,000 kilometers, that brings together 2 distinct yet similar cultures and many different languages and a whole bunch of different people. And by nature of geography and socio-political and geopolitical factors, we are here and we are in this together. So to me, it's a seam. But the point is that this border has changed, and it changed in 1995 when the U.S. government decided that it had a problem with immigration, so we were going to make it impossible to migrate or to sneak across the border in urbanized areas, especially in San Diego and Brownsville. So this process of pinching the migration patterns into the more treacherous desert areas, such as Arizona, worked. It stopped illegal immigration, by and large, in these urbanized areas. Well, what's happened? It sent it all into a more treacherous desert zone, and in 1995, the annual body count of people dying in the desert as they make the trek across started incrementing, to the point where now these zones are our very own conflict zones and war zones, in that there are routes for all manner of illegal trafficking. And if you look at what's happened to the trafficking of people, for example, it has now gone from what used to be a mom and pop operation, where everybody, the coyotes, the people who would bring you across the border illegally, were probably someone you knew in the village, or someone who knew somebody, or I know a guy. Now it's all run by organized crime. And if you don't have the money to get across the border, no problem. Just take this backpack with you, and you'll drop it off at a certain point when you cross the border. So we've turned this whole enterprise into an organized criminal endeavor, and I think that's really ratcheted up what is a conflict zone for us as well.
In a bit, I'd like to kind of come back to some of that to talk about the challenges that confronts journalists in terms of how you cover that if you can't go there. So that's something. So I'd like to now turn to Jania to talk about an experience that you've had, which underscores the fact that being a journalist, you don't have to cross into one of these lawless, stateless frontier zones to be imperiled. Jania, in her work as an investigative reporter and focusing on corruption within Costa Rica, had an episode some years ago in which armed people came into your house. Could you share that story with us, please?
Well, thanks. What happened is that we, for 20 years until last week, 2 weeks ago, we've been investigating systematically corruption in the highest level. And not just that, but also, all sort of mafia connections and within the country. And when this happened, I was at home, and basically a couple of guys came into my house and stole my computer. They didn't want to kill me because they could have killed me, and they just shot me in my leg. And at that point, I didn't know if it was regular crime or if it was related to my work as a journalist. So I didn't want to comment on that. But then 2 weeks after that, the prosecutors who were investigating the criminal cases that were triggered from our investigations had the same episode. They were not shot, but they stole their computers as well. But that was a breaking point in my career, absolutely. And I took another position for 3 years, and I got too bored after that. and I'm back again doing investigative journalism, which is what I like. But yeah, it could be dangerous anywhere in the world, not necessarily in a war zone. So and the thing is that in the very first minute that you decide to become an investigative journalist, that's part of the package. You cannot complain. It's not that of course it's not acceptable that something like that happens, but it could happen. So yeah, we are full of great moments and adrenaline, and it's really amazing to find. If you imagine being just one regular person as I am, and having this possibility of showing to an entire country what's going on, and all these dark dealings between politicians and business people and corporations and organized crime, it's really amazing. These opportunities, I think it's not a job, it's a lifestyle, and yeah, this shouldn't happen, not here, not anywhere in the world, but again, there is a risk included in the whole practice. That
if I could ask you about the scale of that risk as time has gone on, this episode where you were shot was some years ago, but obviously when you're involved in investigations that go to the levels of the president of a country, that involve very large multinational businesses, this is pretty complex and daunting, a daunting challenge for a reporter. The buzzword now is global. Everything has become more global. Now, when you're dealing with corruption, of course, it becomes more and more entangled. Does that make it more dangerous? I know it certainly makes it a lot more complex when you're dealing with people whose connections may extend beyond the borders of Costa Rica or any country.
It is dangerous, and especially if you're touching and affecting somebody else's interests, and these big corporations. We didn't know what we were investigating. We didn't know what was behind the facts we were investigating. At the beginning, it was just a regular corruption case, and then it scaled until we found all these big things. But during all this time, afterwards, we found out that we were on the risk for many, many weeks because they knew what they did, we didn't. And we were flying to Panama to find, evidence in Panama. And then later on, we knew that the former president talked to the then president of Panama, asking her to stop us to go and try to find the evidence. And they tried. They used many ways to stop us. So yeah, I mean the clue here is how to work together. I mean, and this is what I want to address. I mean, I think borders are an illusion. The problem is that we think they are real, and I'm talking about a border in an abstract way. In fact, I don't need to go to, like I've done many investigations without leaving the country, using the internet and many tools that we have available now, and also collaborating with our colleagues in other parts of the world. The problem is that we still think that it's our story, our source, and this kind of arrogant approach of the traditional journalism, it's over. I mean, I don't think we should think that way anymore. As we tried when we were these two investigations, one was related to Finland and the other one to French telecommunications company Alcatel. And when we got the evidence and we wanted to know more about the Finnish connection, then I called a Finnish colleague, an investigative reporter, and said, look, we have all this evidence, and then there were bribes paid by this Finnish company, and this is public money. So, and it was amazing. I mean, he was in the phone and said, "Are you suggesting that there's corruption in Finland?" And I said, "No, I'm not suggesting. I'm telling you. I mean, I have the evidence." And then then I understood why they are always the first in the Transparency International ranking. I mean, this is and after many attempts, I finally got in contact with a very good friend of mine, Minna Gnus Galan, who's she came to Costa Rica, and then we worked together, and the same with France. I mean, I called many colleagues in France, and they are not really interest in what is going on in a banana republic. They are paying bribes in Costa Rica. Okay, well, but it's like a double standard thing. I mean, so yeah. I mean, now we got to work as a team with other colleagues, and not just that, but with other disciplines, with scientists, with programmers, with geographers, and so on. I think this is a great time to be a journalist. We are living this historical moment in which journalism is going to transform into something, I think, better, and we are actors of this history, and then that's why we have a big responsibility in changing our minds, and our mindset has to be different now. I mean, we cannot keep working like we used to work in the past.
Thank you. Mort, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what you think has changed in terms of the peril that journalists face. I mean, just by way of a preamble to this, over the last decade at the New York Times, we've had 4 local employees who were killed overseas. We've had several kidnapping episodes, including one correspondent who was kidnapped and held by the Taliban for 9 months. We've had a photographer who had both of his legs blown off below the knees, unfortunately, and so the question of security, or the question of peril, rather, has been very much on our minds. You and I, at early points in our career, were in some pretty sketchy places, but it wasn't the same as it is now. What's happened?
No, it really wasn't the same. You either had to have bad luck or be pretty stupid, or or run off the road or something. Because correspondents were pretty much seen as garnish at the side of the plate. I mean, people in various situations kind of thought, I don't know why they thought that we might somehow help them if they kind of gained our favor, or they just didn't bother with us. And at some point they figured out that if you want some attention, grab a journalist, or there's a whole lot of different reasons, and of course a lot of political causes, and they're getting crazy. But it's because what Janina's been saying, what Rick said, and what you've said in your preamble is that I mean, it used to be different in other ways. I mean, I'm now going to say a name which I know will bring a smile to Bill's face, John Kiffner. Kiff is anybody who knows him, and I mean, he looks like Roman Polanski in a good mood. And he's this wonderful correspondent who, he would get in these situations overseas, and he'd play what he called his dumb schmuck card. He'd play like a little dumb schmuck tourist. He'd look up at the guy, and he'd get through anything. I was actually in Syria in the early rounds when Assad's father was bombing Hama. Kiffner and I, just by coincidence, happened to be there at the same time, and Kiff, he just went through all that stuff. He didn't quite make it there, but today, you can't do that anymore. Today, I was just in a little place called the Comoros. It's these little islands off the coast of South Africa in the Indian Ocean, and they've had 21 coups in their 25 years of independence or something. I mean, it's a crazy place. It's a highly Muslim. It's caught somewhere between the 14th and the 22nd century, and so I'm there with this photographer with kind of hair, and we're walking around, and a couple days we're there, and all of a sudden these goons show up, and we're sitting there, and there's three guys, and one is kind of the official goon, and the other guy's the cop goon, and he's fingering his sidearm, looking menacingly, and then there's the third goon who's kind of the nice guy, and he's taking notes, and this guy has a printout from Google, and he knows, more about me than Bill looked up for his kind introduction. Everything he's asking me about, and I'm looking, and I'm thinking, shit, and if I'd have pulled some kind of story, I mean, you have to know what to tell these guys. It wasn't really dangerous. I mean, and I wasn't too worried because the guy that was taking notes was using the inside cartridge of a Bic pen, and there was no ink in it. And so he'd write on the paper, there'd be no impression. And I thought, well, if we get out of this, there's not going to be a follow-up. And, this was not dangerous. But it could have been. I mean, if you said the wrong thing or somehow you got their suspicion up, and it's very tricky. And I think that the problem now, again, as Jenya said, is there's such thing as global international journalism. There's such thing as borders. If they ever existed, they're gone. A story, I mean, I would go to a place and I'd go to some really strange place and I'd have to cross a cultural bridge. I'd have to take that society and try to figure it out and, explain it to readers. If I was working for the Star, I'd have to explain it to just a small bunch of readers. If it was America, But now everything's everywhere. And you you really have got to be where things are. But now, when you go somewhere, I mean, the numbers for last year: 71 journalists killed in last year, half in Syria. You go to Bayeux, which is this little town that survived World War II, and they have a monument dedicated to journalists. And every year they give this War Correspondents' Prize. There's a park. And they have these these columns of names, just column after column after column. And they started after World War II because this is a town that survived World War II. There were, at the end of 2011, there were 2,183 names and those are just the names they were able to get of journalists who were killed doing their job. Not necessarily war casualties, not necessarily people who somebody came into their living room, all told, all things. And then we're adding, now. And now, because of so many other reasons, we're sending out people that aren't trained, that don't have the backup, and so in the end, there's a couple things to keep in mind. Number one, journalists have to be free. I mean, journalists have to be free, but journalism cannot be free. You can't have it free. It just, there's too much of a cost. There's cost in blood, but there's also cost in plane tickets, and there's cost in everything else. And so I'm kind of going on here, but I think it's really important because if we don't train people, and I was about to say kids, and that's not the right word because it's not a question of age. I mean, it's just, there's some of us old guys that ought to be shot. I mean, practice makes permanent. And there are some young people, Sam, for example, who was already out there, already doing the job as well as anybody can do it. It's not a question of age. It's a question of wanting to do it, wanting to get it right. understanding the ethics, understanding it's not about you, it's about the story. And we, everybody else, have got to support them. We've got to pay for our news. We've got to respect who they are, because if they're not there, we're not there.
You know, I just to pick up on that, back up a little bit, and to emphasize the scale. When we talk about, you listen to these numbers from the what the Committee to Protect Journalists records, 70 deaths in the past year. It's really extraordinary. When you think about it, during World War II, the New York Times lost 2 people during the entire war. The Times lost nobody during Vietnam. Yet the scale of casualties and kidnappings just in the last 10 years between Iraq and Afghanistan, the Middle East and Libya has really been extraordinary. What are your thoughts? And we may be venturing a little bit beyond journalism into the world of political science and foreign affairs and international relations, but why is this happening? What the emergence of these kind of lawless areas we talk about in the border, the rise of the cartels? I guess I'm giving some of the answer here, but some of your thoughts about tribalism, the rise of sectarianism, the fact that when you're kidnapped now, it's non-transactional. In the old days, when you got kidnapped, there was a ransom note and they wanted something back. These people who are missing in Syria, we hear nothing. They just go missing. There's no demand from anybody. What is that all about?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I look at the globe, I look at a globe and I just kind of think, God, I mean, whole sections of it are closing down. I mean, take a country like Mali. There's no great. It's an incredible country, Mali. Just listen to the music from Mali. But the Dogon statues and these, the Tuaregs and stuff. And I used to work a lot with this really great French photographer named Jerome Delay Frog. And we had this, this thing going about, tell us no, good luck. We just didn't take no, and we'd end up in these crazy ass places. We'd go way up into the Sahel, toward the Sahara Desert, and on camel trains and. You'd at Timbuktu at night and walk around, or in Pakistan, everybody talks about Peshawar. When I first went to Peshawar, there was one guy at the American consul at the council, and, I'd go over and see him at the end of the day. He'd take out one key from, he'd lock this little Slade lock and, close it, open to the street, the door. We'd go off and sit all night drinking coffee in the bazaar of Peshawar, the American consul. Try that today. So many places of the world are just shut off because of, of this access problem. But I'm getting away from your question. But actually, I'm not though. Things are just closing down. That's one problem. The other problem is, we tend to think that because we can see things and we can know things instantaneously and stuff, that we actually get it. And I really keep in mind, this is already now some years ago, but I really always remember when I try to think of this thing in 2009, about the time when everybody was getting their fancy phones and stuff. They had this, you remember about the middle of, in June, in 2009, there was this huge series of riots in downtown Tehran. And there was this woman, this beautiful young woman named Aghaneda Sultan. And she's driving, toward this, driving toward the middle of this, and she's standing outside of her car because, it's hot and things are going, and she gets shot in the chest and she collapses. And everybody's there with her, and all of a sudden, within seconds, 1 billion people see these images. And everybody is saying, oh, that's it, the Islamic Revolution, okay, they're changing now, they're all going to, be in church on Sunday, or they'll get a rabbi, whatever. But, bullshit. Everybody got it wrong at the speed of light. It was nothing about religion. That wasn't changing at all. It was their Florida. It was their hanging Chad. Whereas in, this country, you dispute an election. Well, somebody, maybe he won, but he says, no, I didn't really win. And everybody grumbles on the internet. In Iran, they went in the streets, like the Ukraine, another story. But and so the point is you might be able to see things. That's why I worry about Google Glasses and stuff. You still need journalists. You still need reporters. A journalist can be pretty much anything. A reporter is someone who's there, who sees it. And in answer to your question, it's harder for these reporters to be there. The New York Times did a really good job then because, they had reporters in there, and the Iranians were cracking down, and Roger Cohen kind of hid for a while, but being named Cohen, he didn't want to hide too long, and Bobby Worth was on the outside, and there was a really great Times reporter who was a stringer, a full-time stringer, and she was Iranian, she did a really good job until they really threatened her family, and she went to Canada, so she's coming. And we covered it from the Times covered it, and other people covered it from the outside. You have to cover the news. And if you don't get the news from the inside, you'll get it from the outside, but you got to be there.
Janine, you wanted to pick up on some of that?
Yeah, I wanted to add something about this last question, because I think we are part of the problem, we journalists. What I've seen in Mexico, I just came back from Mexico to training 100 journalists there, and what I've seen is that there are two Mexicos. I mean, you go to DF, the capital, and you see no problem there. I mean, it's totally unbelievable that there are those things going on in the coast and in the north and so on. And my first question was in Mexico, I mean, how did this happen? I mean, how is it this happened? And it happened because nobody cares about the regions. Nobody cares about the local governments. I mean, nobody even know the name of the alcalde or the local government. In Costa Rica is happening exactly the same in all Central America. Like, we are focused on the mainstream power and the leaders, the president and the Congress, and we are too focused on that we forget the not important politicians, and that's why they are easily viable. And they, organized crime, buy them easily because nobody cares. And I think that's a new approach that we need to have. Like, look at the regions again, and with a different perspective. And I hope it's not too late.
Interesting, Rick.
Yeah. Well, yeah, just as a follow up to that, I mean, and I go back to that point in 1995 when I talked about the effort to close off the borders at the ends and to pinch it off. It coincides with the beginning of a disruption of the traditional or the long-held model of drug trafficking and the drug business in Mexico, where you had the most powerful cartels were actually on the coasts, and it mirrored that migration pattern in a way. And that is disrupted, and the cartels that rise are the ones Juarez and Sinaloa. And again, it mirrors this change in the way we enforce our borders. And I think, so it's kind of coincidence that I think Janina's right in that if you only focus your international coverage on these global capitals, and you forget about what's happening in these provinces that feed to us, for example, in Mexico, feed us with migrants, feed us with all manner of things, you can lose a handle on a really good story. And so that's a very important idea to take away from this. The other thing I think that's happened in the last 10, 15 years is the explosion of information. My first taste of that was in 1994 when I'm in the Lacandon jungle, and after a long wait, I'm finally interviewing Subcomandante Marcos in Chiapas when they had the uprising in '94. And what amazed me is that the first words out of his mouth when he finally meets us at 1 a.m. in the morning in this tiny schoolhouse is he puts a flashlight on me and says, "Oh, you guys are here from San Francisco." In English asks, "What the hell happened to the 49ers?" And it turns out that the guy had this great, turns out he had a satellite connection, and he knew a lot of stuff, and he knew about the small group of reporters that was going to come to meet him, including Joel Simon, who is now with the Committee to Protect Journalists. We all went in together, and he knew about us before we got there. So that leads to today. You can't hide. And people out in the field in the smallest communities know the power and the impact, the potential impact a good story is going to have on them, and the potential negative impact that it's going to have on them. So as reporters anymore, we can't hide by this fact that we're reporters for a distant country that's never going to have anything to do with you. My stories are going to be published in the U.S., and so no big deal. It's global now.
It's interesting. There's a certain irony in all of this, I think, because when you look at what happened in the Arab Spring and many of the other revolutions, which were driven in part by social media and people's access to these tools that empowered them, On the other hand, it's the same empowerment and the same speed with which technology is now pervasive and information is everywhere that can make a journalist's life more difficult.
Exactly. All the cartels in Mexico, and even the smaller organizations that aren't officially cartels, they all have information divisions. They all have somebody on their team who knows their way around a computer, who knows their way around the web, and they have intelligence units. In some cases, they have intelligence units that match what our official government intelligence units can do. Mm-hmm. So it's not that we can't go down there in anonymous fashion anymore and expect that our position or our condition as U.S. journalists is going to defend us anymore. And it's worse for the native or the local journalists because they can't leave. They're there. It's home.
Exactly. More, do you have a point?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Rick just touched on a really important thing, and we should think about this a lot, is that getting back to this theme about paying for stuff, we use now, I mean, we've always used, we've called them locals, we've called them all sorts of names, but the organized press, legacy press, whatever, of the old style, always used either stringers or local correspondents or stuff, people in their own societies, because they're better than we are. I mean, they know, they know these stories, the background, they know the people, they know why, and they speak the language and stuff. But they're also connected. They've got families there. They can't hop on a plane like we can. Also, they've got, their own ties. I mean, you can't expect to come in and pay a guy, 20 cents a day or $100 a week or something like that and expect that to overcome the loyalties of a lifetime. And so, because we're the big organizations are not sending reporters out, and because we're relying much more on these locals, and some are terrific, some are really, really good, and it's not about the money, and some aren't, and so that's becoming a problem.
In fact, there was a piece, and I mentioned it earlier, in Foreign Policy not long ago that talked about the problems that correspondents in Afghanistan on the border of Syria now have, where some of the fixers, the people that they relied on historically to get them across the border, to help them with the local customs, many of them have been co-opted now by the jihadists, and they're actually involved in the business of setting up kidnappings for these people.
The most problems I've had is by guys that I've hired to protect me. I mean, in Somalia, I got halfway from Mogadishu to, Baidoa when my technicals, these guys, bristling with guns, decide to renegotiate the contract. Not a lot of leverage. Yeah,
in 1998, we opened a bureau in Havana, the Dallas Morning News, and our first fixer, or our first office assistant, turned out worked for the Cuban military, and so then she had the nightly download from the hard drive. So it's it's hard to escape these kinds of realities that you'll face out in the future.
It's fascinating. When I was based in what was then the Soviet Union, for a couple of years, and we had office help and household help that was supplied to us by the Soviet government. Well, guess who they really worked for? They weren't really working for us. So, listen. Now that I've got you all warmed up, and I referred earlier to the existential dilemma that journalism faces, which is that at the core of it is this idea that it is our job to bear witness, whether you bear witness in a corruption investigation in Costa Rica or on the border of Mexico or from the bureau in Kinshasa. The idea is you go there and you find this information, and it enlightens all of us, and it becomes the oil of democracy. If you can't go there, or if you are so threatened when you try to go there, what do we do? I mean, this is a real problem for the whole meaning and purpose of journalism. Rick, do you have any thoughts about that?
You have to. I don't know. It's even though there are parts of Mexico that I won't go to, I still know what's happening. I still know what's going on there because we have good contacts and we have people on the ground. I have people on the ground in most parts of Mexico who I trust if there's a set of information or is there something I need from that area, I can still get it. The Miami Herald still gets great information out of Cuba, even though they're not allowed to go on the island. So there are ways of doing it, but it's a matter of building that trust And that task is now even more difficult because we aren't able to access places like Syria. So a modern example of that is Syria. And one of the potential answers, it's a threat to these organizations, but in a way, a lot of these organizations also are now being staffed by former journalists. And I'm thinking specifically of Human Rights Watch. They have routinely gone into Syria when journalists can't. They go in and they've had conversations with journalists and been able to report what they see and be these kinds of eyes and ears. So there are more organizations that can do that for us. But again, it's not easy because it's a matter of building up that trust and knowing that the information that you're going to get from these NGOs and people on the ground is going to be confirmable and perhaps that's the word in English.
It's
confiable in Spanish. It's a confidence.
It's also a matter of tactics. Where I wanted to ask Janina about this because you are so expert at the idea of going after data now, and material that, in other words, rather than the idea that boots on the ground always are fundamental. You want a reporter who's inside Syria, who's telling you what's actually happening there. That's one of the great problems we have even in trying to work our Syrian policy now. We don't really know what's happening in places there. But so leaving that aside as the great exception in the room, you have figured out how to find out a lot of things by looking in data, and this would also apply in kind of looking across a border, I assume.
Totally, especially that. What we've been doing for the last 4 years is gathering all the public information that we can. I mean, and I'm serious that we have collected more databases than the government itself. And we stored all this data, we cleaned the data, process it, and correlate the data in a way that we can interview oceans of databases. So the nice part here is that the questions must be good. I mean, you gotta know how to interview big data, and that's what we have been doing. And you would wonder why, to do that, and that's the answer is, and I'm really not fond of denominations. I don't like investigative journalism, data journalism, and all this, because people think that that data journalism is about being in a computer all day long, and like they imagine a geek not having contact with reality, not interviewing real people, and then so on. There's nothing more wrong than that. What we are doing, it's incorporating to the best of the traditional journalism a new powerful technique that basically serves as the guide to do the reporting. For instance, like this is not corruption related. We just got the census, the last census in the country, and for the first time, the census asked people what do they do with their waste, and some of them, I mean, we wrote lots of stories about this. Some people said that they are throwing the waste to the rivers. So we mapped all this population. We know how many people live in every house, and we calculated how much each of them are producing, and then and when we mapped also all the rivers in the country and the whole country, and we could say precisely how much, how contaminated is this river or the other. Then after you have this information, then you go and do the reporting. You go to the river, you follow the whole thing. But just imagine, for instance, in the past we were not able to interview 4 million people, right? There was no way that we can, for instance, a subsidy that the government gives to 4 million people. Just imagine something like that. And now we can interview like hundreds of millions of records in seconds. And so, for instance, for a subsidy that we were looking at, how many people were receiving a subsidy as homeless. I mean, we got like 200,000 people, and we don't see that many homeless in the streets. So we took the database and cross-referenced all these database with people with salaries, cars, income, properties, and so on. And guess what? I mean, a third of the of these beneficiaries were not homeless people. They received this subsidy because they were offered a subsidy to vote for a specific politician, and that, we found that on the field. But otherwise, in a regular, investigative journalism, we could have found 2 or 3 or 4 irregular cases, and then we go to the administrator of this program and say, look, I have proven that these people are not able to receive the benefit, and they would say, oh, thank you. Those are the only 4 people who are receiving the benefit. So that, I mean, it's a whole new world, and yeah, and now I'm campaigning for the last 4 years. At the beginning, people thought that I was crazy. I wanted to create a secure platform for investigative journalists, that we could share our data in a way that if I have a name, for instance, I have all the companies based in Costa Rica, and I have a name of an Ukrainian, and then a colleague of mine has this same name in this platform related to organized crime, and so it can send us an alert, like, look, guys, you have to talk. You have a common match record. I think that's the future, and I hope it's going to be soon.
Let me just,
please go ahead, Rick.
One thing that Janine has not talked about that I think that is illustrative of the kind of work that can emerge from data journalism is her pivotal role in this effort that was put on by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists to basically lift the veil off of hundreds of thousands of offshore accounts that previously had never been seen in public before. And what Janina and a group of journalists from around the world did is put these names out and talk about busting borders. I mean, that was impressive work.
Well, it was a work done by my team, actually. When ICIJ received these 2 databases, they spent like around a year talking to different people in Germany and so on, and they didn't know how to, it was 160 times bigger than WikiLeaks, the whole disk. And they contacted me and asked, can you deal with this? And then we started to work. I mean, I thought that it was going to be easy. As soon as we saw the kind of mess, it was more than 320 tables, totally unrelated. It was like recreating a whole complex thing. And so we developed the interactive application that is on the web. You can go and actually try to find some valuable information. It's offshoreleaks.icij.org.
Just coming back again to the question of dealing with or trying to cover or tell people what's happening in these fragile states or states where there's a state of insurrection or war or turmoil and it's difficult to get over. Technology has opened other ways to see what's going on inside these countries. We learned this from Iran. Certainly Mort was referring to that earlier with Twitter feeds and with social media. Just earlier today, I was looking at the amazing stuff online today from Kiev, where the situation has gotten much, much worse in the last 24 hours, and the number of people have been killed in the protests there. Lots of video online coming from the people who are there. Either people who might represent themselves if you ask them as journalists or citizen journalists, or just protesters or members of different advocacy groups or that are on the scene. Is that a substitute for actually having a report on the ground, Mort?
Well, no, it's really funny you should mention Kiev, because the last time the 3 of us were in the same room was in Kiev. There's this wonderful international gathering, a biannual gathering of investigative journalists, and we'd go out at night. We had some really great dinners, and drank a lot of wine, and nobody was dying in the streets except maybe if one of us tripped. And you really, when countries go blow or societies fall apart or things happen, you kind of have to understand the context. And I mean, Ukraine is this, it's part of the evil empire, but yes, it's a bridge between Europe, and there's a tug of war between the European Union and Putin, like again, I was talking about the hanging chads in Iran. I mean, when the Ukrainians didn't like, the results of the announced results of a presidential election, they spent 6 weeks outside in the snow. So you have to understand the societies you're reporting on. And so if you're a news editor sitting a long distance away, you can't get in, or you're doing an analysis from somewhere, you can't be everywhere all the time. I mean, certainly not if you're covering a space shot or, bottom of the sea trip, but you can understand the context and the story, and that's vital.
Rick, your experience in Mexico, where you can rely on the social media, how do you integrate that into your own understanding of what's happening, or use it, or is it a substitute?
I think it's a complement. I don't think it's a substitute. And even if you talk to people who are behind a lot of the really innovative social media endeavors, there's some really, like Rio Doce and other websites in Mexico that are trying to cover the drug wars. What's behind them, and it seems pretty nifty because they're able to put it out on social media, what's behind them and what drives them is actually street intelligence. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of having people on the streets in these kinds of stories. Because if you don't have that connection to the streets and what's happening in communities at the micro level, you can't tell a macro picture. You can't tell a story about the macro story about a country. And it comes down to know, I mean, I hit on this note constantly, but I grew up in a neighborhood that wasn't one of the nicest neighborhoods in San Diego, and I grew up with guys. I often tell the story that, and one of these days it will be a book, I hope. The guys I grew up with, one became a reporter, two became cops. One's a federal cop. There's actually a fifth person who's now a prosecutor, and another person in our group was a people smuggler, who then turned to cocaine, trafficking cocaine. And we all knew each other.
That's a great book, by the way.
Rick, which one are you?
But the thing is that it's and this is a border experience. And I'm telling you, this is you talk to family after family on the U.S.-Mexico border. We all have these connections. When I was working in Mexico, or even subsequently, I have editors ask me, how is it that you know what's happening in this particular marketplace? One story we were writing about was how the shift was happening from the mom and pop coyote to organized crime moving people. And I had to confess, I called a cousin who was involved in the business, and it could tell me what it was like in the old days and how he got pushed out of the business. I have another cousin who ran a string of very successful pharmacies in Tijuana, and one day got a phone call from a lawyer who he knew, and the lawyer says, it's time to sell the business. And he says, I'm not interested in selling the business. Well, you don't have a choice. You have to sell the business. And 6 months later, that business that he sold ends up on the OFAC list in the U.S., the State Department's no touch list, with the list of businesses that you can't do business with because they're related to organized crime. And I was thinking, when I saw that name on the list, I think that's my cousin's pharmacy. So I called him and said, what the hell happened? And out of that emerged a pretty cool story about how small business and mid-sized businesses were being subsumed and being taken over by organized crime across the length of the border. But it's street intelligence. I mean, you can't get past that.
And we'll use what we can when we have to, and family's great in a pinch.
Yeah.
So, listen, one of the things that's obviously affected this whole our ability, our window that we have and what's happening abroad, have been the changes to the industry. The number of reporters who are now working abroad has declined. That is, the number of reporters working for mainstream news organizations generally, and this is a reflection of the economic difficulties that the industry has been in. So, in many parts of the world, and Sonia mentioned this earlier in a class when we were talking about this, you've seen a reliance on freelance reporters, eager volunteers. And I think particularly since we're at a university here and there's a lot of young people and students in the audience who have an interest in maybe cutting their teeth or getting a job overseas, this idea of using freelancers in very, very difficult places, how should the industry deal with this? And Mort, you mentioned earlier, money is a factor, so.
Money's a factor. I mean, money is a microphone. Money's a factor, and as Janina said in the class, this has never been a more exciting time for journalism in general, but for young reporters starting out. There's a few catches. You have to be willing to starve to death, and people are likely to shoot at you. But other than that, this is really a cool time. And the problem is that. I was mentioning before that in the Washington Post bureau in Paris, a great guy named Keith Richburg, who uses an awful lot of interns, had clipped out a New Yorker cartoon, and it showed this galley boat, and these these guys were just rowing away like crazy. And one guy had the drum, and the other guy was looking over. He says, galley slave is such a demeaning term. Let's call them interns. And I mean, the thing is you don't get. It's very hard to get paid. And it's very hard to get, you need training. You really need safety training. I mean, and if you work for a big organization, they'll demand it because their insurance companies want it. But if you're a freelancer and you're selling, and I'm not making this up, pictures for $7 each in Syria in certain cases, or you're getting $150 a story from somebody, you can work cheap, but, so you have to put together a lot of strings, and you've got to work really quickly, and you don't have time to develop the contacts. You don't have time to work with others. And so you might be doing a good job. You might be doing an excellent job, working very hard, applying a lot of skill, but you're only going to get a part of the story. I mean, just real quickly, I'll use my favorite, because we're in Tucson, I'll use my favorite analogy. When we had a press corps, press corps is, and we just saved our cat up the hill here, above river. So this is we see how this works. Imagine a pack of coyotes, right? Okay, pack of coyotes work together, and one of them kind of hangs out in the front and does the investigative work that, say, Janina does, and and sniffs out the story and kind of gets ahead, and then corners the prey, whatever it is, jumps in, takes the first bite, and the others cut it off, and everybody kind of slowly gnaws it to death, and then all the coyotes eat, and then the prey gets really used. The way things work now under this system, not derogatory to anybody in it, is like a bunch of hyenas. We all dart out of the bushes and grab the thing for ourselves and pull it back and chew on the carcass as much as we can, and then just leave it till it rots. And who suffers is everybody else. The society suffers because you don't really get the whole impact of the story.
Does the industry, such as it is, and I guess now I'm talking not only about the mainest of the mainstream, like the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or the Washington Post, but there are lots of digital news organizations out there, some of which are getting funded big time now by Wall Street, things like Gawker and BuzzFeed and others. And BuzzFeed, believe it or not, is actually sending foreign correspondents now. And I had a phone call a few weeks ago because people knew I did some of this work with the Times, asking for some advice on trying to send somebody into Syria. Of course, my advice was don't send anybody into Syria. Does the industry, however you want to describe it, have any kind of moral obligation in the way they should be supporting these stringers, or simply telling them not to go?
That's a really good question, and it really depends on the situation. In the case of the New York Times, where Bill, has spent a lot of his own time thinking and figuring out how to protect people, that question can be answered. But what do you do about some startup company where some internet millionaire or something like that wants to make an impact and just doesn't get it? Or what do you do? I mean, what is the moral thing for sending somebody out and paying him $150 for a story for which he or she is going to risk a life? And yeah, of course there's a moral thing, but I always take it back, and it's hard to define and it's a little vague, but it's all of our responsibility. I mean, we as a society have got to, and again, I realize how impractical this is, but they're working for us, these people out there. They're our eyes, they're our ears out there. And we need to respect their product. It doesn't answer your question, and it really doesn't answer anything because it's impractical, but I think that's the wider setting. So yeah, I mean, these guys, guys like Vice and places like that where they send you out with Google glasses and stuff, and that's gimmickry.
Yeah, I think there is a responsibility. I would love for Ariana Huffington, and I would love for Piero Midiar and all the others who are now becoming, making quite a nice living off of the work of people out in the streets, is to put up money for to support the work of the Committee to Protect Journalists, to support the work of these different organizations, both U.S. and internationally, that are popping up and offering journalists safety training, security training, and to make this part even of curriculums, where we show you best practices that are transferable across borders. I think that's a way that the industry can pay back a little bit the efforts of freelancers and people who put it on the line and get that $150.
I mean, that's a great point, Rick. And I mean, by asking this question or even bringing up the subject, I'm not trying to anyway, denigrate or suggest that freelancers don't have a place. They're very, very critical. The question is, how do you equip them? How do you prepare them? How do you train them? And how do you support them? And I think there's more the industry can do. For example, a lot of freelancers go abroad. They have no insurance. They have no health insurance. They have no life insurance. And the idea that the industry, maybe working together, can come up with some sort of pool arrangement to at least support these people, to equip them. When Libya began to fall apart, a lot of freelancers rushed in, and many of them had no flak jackets, no helmets. It was sort of this is another question I have about what I call adventure journalism, where we've seen some people who are so kind of fascinated with the idea of going overseas and being in the action that they get way, way over their heads, but that's another issue. Mort, did you have one?
Yeah, I did. That's exactly as you're saying. There are things happening now. There's a wonderful new organization, unfortunately I forget the name, that's working with the Frontline Club in London to do exactly that, where freelancers can get a community going.
Is this Sebastian Junger's group?
No, that's another good one. That's a risk. Freelance. It's Freelancers Union. It's Freelancers something. Is it Union or something like? It's a Freelancers something. But if you go to the Frontline Club, they've got a link to it. Like the OPC in New York, the Frontline Club is a really good source by itself because a lot of professionals hang out there. But they support groups like this. This is a group of freelancers that are getting together to negotiate things, to get people flak jackets, to do stuff like that.
Yeah, and there's security protocols that Human Rights Watch has a pretty intricate security protocol for researchers. And when I was working with them last year, we all had to undergo this security training. And I thought to myself, this is something that we could do for all journalists. Yeah. It's not rocket science, really, and there's some protocols that you can easily follow that would make that would add just it's perhaps pretty threadbare and thin, but at least a layer of comfort and security when you go out as an independent journalist.
Yeah. We've gone on for about an hour and 50 minutes here, so I wanted to leave time for questions from the audience. And before I do that, I forgot to say something, forgive me, that among our audience today, we do have some longtime members of the Overseas Press Club, including Don Underwood, who is here with his wife, Patty, who is thank you so much for coming and being part of this. Don worked for Life magazine for many years, so thank you. Any questions from the audience? There's one. I won't be able to answer this because I won't have a microphone. So.
One quick question. So I'm a graduate of the nonfiction program, the MFA program here. I did a piece a couple of years back on Agent Orange and the remains of this, the Operation Ranch and these C-123s, which are actually intricately connected with, the Central America, the Contras, the only American POW during that time was shot down in a 123. It's been, one of them in Guatemala has been made into a restaurant. I mean, there's just all kinds of stuff, right? And anyway, I did this piece. I didn't realize at the time, I found these planes out there. My hands are sort of messed up. My dad was in Tay Ninh province in 1970. So, you know, I got Dick Shelton to just write me a little note, and I got basically everywhere I wanted to go in there. It was pretty easy. They're civilian, it's civilian run, but apparently I didn't realize that they'd been using these planes throughout the 70s and early 80s, and the only reason they really retired them was because the 130 is just a better plane. They were contaminated as hell with dioxin, except most of them were, but not all, because they don't really have very good records. Well, I wrote this piece, and they ended up, you know, it won a pushcart prize and was, you know, well received, and they ended up, as a result, destroying these planes. I had no idea. I get this weird email from this guy. You know, he's done all these Freedom of Information Act requests. Like, there's all this Air Force memos, and my name's all over them, right? You know, and so I started doing this work. I get a little tiny grant to go over to Vietnam, spend hundreds of hours doing research before I go there. When I come back, right, after this piece is published, and this PR campaign has gone on, and the consultant who's been hired has been the liaison between the American embassy and the Vietnamese embassy in Hanoi, who I get audited making $26,000 a year. All right, I get.
Is there a question for us here?
So what my question is, where the hell and there, I don't have, and right now I have some stories that need to be told, but no one's paying for me to go anywhere. And I'm as a non-tenure track faculty member who, I just look, we're hiring, not to diminish this, but 4 transgender studies employees, which is a tenure track faculty, and it's not that that's not important, but we're talking life and death situations here.
That's a good question, sir.
And what about the politics of heroin, Alfred McCoy,
A real question.
and relating to these cartel issues? Is anything new? I mean, is this a new story or not, or is this ever going to change? And are you ever, are tenure track or tenured faculty ever going to stand up, make sure that we have the freedoms that y'all had, so that we can do the kind of work that we need to do in order to get these stories out? Because right now it feels like that's not happening. That promise made by Howard Zinn and by Angela Davis has not been kept. That oath has not been held up by this next generation.
I hear you, and we understand. I don't know if anybody wants to respond to what's going on in Latin America.
I'll answer that. Probably not.
Yeah, probably not. Okay.
But there is actually a growing. It's not perhaps a market, but there is, with the explosion of the internet and self-publishing and creating websites and things like that. There are increased opportunities to tell your story. I'm the new president of an organization called the Fund for Investigative Journalism, and we, on a grant basis, support investigative journalism throughout the world now. And the criteria has always been that you have a letter of support from a publisher, but increasingly we're actually looking at websites and even self-publishing as a means of putting the word out. So I mean, it's. I don't think that I think that we're actually growing the number of outlets that are potentially there for it.
Let's have another question.
Okay. Does anybody else have a question? Right there.
Sam.
Sorry. Thanks all for coming and sharing a little bit of your experience and wisdom with us all. And I have a question. Earlier we talked a little bit about, more in your class, about who's on the team and how you have collaborators and how you work with people. And we've talked a little bit today about sources, I guess, and maybe how to protect them and things like that. But I'm more interested in who you work with outside of journalism, within academia, within the tech world, but who are the partners? What are the industries that you collaborate with or think we need to do more of? You know, certainly not PR, right? But who are we looking? Are we talking to biologists? Are we talking to climate scientists? Yeah, I appreciate that.
Thanks. Well, I've been working with scientists for like 18 years, and there's a funny story about how I started to work along with these guys. I came to the U.S. for IRE training on mapping, and I was absolutely amazed on the things that you can do, by learning how to map information. And so I went back to the paper and I said, I want you to buy MapInfo, one software to, do mapping. And that time we didn't have open source great tools like we have now. And it costed like around $25,000 or so, one license. And then said, yeah, you crazy? No. I mean, of course, it's not just about the money. I mean, you got to be a geographer in order to know how to process all this thing. And then somebody listened to me talking about this. And, did you say MapInfo? There's a guy who's sitting in the other building who's called MapInfo. Maybe, there's something related to that. So I went to his tiny little office, and and I found this really special person, Edgar Mendez. He's a geographer and a programmer, and he was in charge of the distribution of the newspaper. Okay, so he was working for the commercial area, and he did all the routes to deliver the newspaper. And I said, look, I have some ideas for the elections and for this subsidies database that I was working on. And he said, oh, yeah, I'm gonna help you. And it's amazing. I was just telling the class this afternoon that when you start collaborating with all these people, they don't stop suggesting things. they chase you all over the world. And I have many thousands of examples, but that was the start when I thought. And the first experience we had was so amazing that then we created this for the elections. For the first time, we had this map in which we could show the results proportionally with the density of the population. And it was a crazy map that we built, but it was the first time in history. And so now they are part of there are 4 geographers in the company, and their formal part of their formal job is to assist and help journalists. But geographers, programmers, I cannot understand why we are not programming at the university right now. That's not a luxury, it's a need. And but in the meantime, we can work along with programmers. And programmers, geographers, statisticians are super important. Most of the work we have done is dealing with these guys, and I don't want to sound like I do prefer sometimes to work with them than work with journalists. Is really amazing the approach they have, and their set of mind is totally different, and they help you to see realities in a different way and to construct and of course designers as well. They know how to tell a story.
I would think certainly as journalism, the question is how much of it is journalism and how much of it's technology nowadays, and we're kind of lost in all that. And so I know at the Times, the kind of partnerships and the collaborations that are being done with ways to both mine data, to apply data, to find new ways to reach audiences. Is really pretty extraordinary. But within the university here, I think it's really interesting how the university and this department and how the School of Journalism now works across campus in establishing the kinds of relationships it does with, and I'm not thinking of technology, which seems kind of a no-brainer that you're going to go to people for help with that, but the work that you're doing with either whether it's gender studies or with the Middle Eastern Institute or any of the other regional studies groups here is a huge part of where part of your training, and something the journalists have to be aware of and know who they can go to, who have the tools and the resources. Any other questions out there? I'm sorry, I have to give this up.
Thank you for coming, and thank you for the work you do. It used to be years ago, in the days of Walter Cronkite and Edward R. Murrow, that I felt as if the news shaped opinion and educated us and moved us along a continuum. And the work you do certainly does that to the audience that receives your work. But it seems as if the information is not always easy to obtain as a listener or a reader. It takes work to find it in Tucson, Arizona, but I suppose in many places of the world. To what degree do you feel an obligation to shape opinion, to raise a call for action, and how does that manifest itself in the work you do? Because it seems as if many people are so preoccupied with, their attention is elsewhere.
That's a really, really good question, because it's probably I mean, for old reporters, I mean, there was a time when you mentioned Cronkite. I mean, there was a time when, people sat down, it was like kind of like gathering around the fire. Here was old Walter, and nobody hired him for his looks, and when he finally went over to Vietnam and came back and said, we're not going to win this war. I mean, Johnson said, oh shit, it's all over. And that was it. These days it's all so fragmented for all the reasons we've said. But as a reporter, when you go in and you see something like, I mean, I'm thinking like, for example, Bosnia. You go into a place like that and you see, all these complex things going on. And you look at it closely and all of a sudden, it's not really so complex. I mean, I had a great colleague named Blaine Harden, who worked for the Washington Post. I guess he's back again. And he looks around and everybody was saying, oh, it's too complicated to figure out all these ethnies. And Blaine says, well, yeah, it's about as complicated as armed robbery. You know what I mean? There was a clear bad guy and there was some clear other guys. And then if you ignore it long enough, then everybody's a bad guy. So as a reporter, you kind of want to say, come on, everybody, this is the bad guy. But as a if you're a wire animal, especially if you're working for a news agency, or if you're a reporter trying to get it right, fair and balanced, it's a problem. I mean, the idea, and this is the ideal for a good reporter, a good journalist, is to see as many sides as possible. We always say get both sides, but I've never seen a story with, less than 20. Get all sides, try to understand it in a fair way, and get across enough so that the people who are reading can actually make up their minds, but kind of steer them. But again, now that's tricky ground, because are you shaping opinion or are you reporting?
Yeah, it's they said this earlier today that I've never practiced objective journalism. I think in my career, because I go through it. I go to any situation with my own biases or whatever. But what I have emphasized in my career is fairness and accuracy. And accuracy above all else. Because sometimes you might try to be fair, but you can't because of access to, or someone refusing to talk to you. But I think that what you're asking is actually quite interesting, because these days we are so nichified in the media, and you can look and find and only hear your echo that reflects the opinion that you have, and it's going to validate whatever opinion you have. What I think is incumbent on us as educators and as journalists is to comb this out of the process so that we train people, and we have people who are writing stories and producing copy and producing radio pieces and television spots that transcend that nichification. That's the tougher target to hit. But I think the entities that will succeed, even in this stratified environment that we have in the media, are going to be the ones that can transcend these layers of opinions and give you a good, solid story that tells a complete picture, that paints a complete picture. And that, unfortunately, is the most difficult and expensive kind of journalism to practice. Yeah. So.
That's terrific. Any other questions out there?
Well, thank you very much. You talked about technology and social media, and for the older people, maybe writing was a little different than it might be today, and I'm just wondering your opinion about writing, say, for websites, writing for the digital press, and is it affecting writing, thinking, approach? I mean, deadlines, you've got
everything, more than that. We used to write. I mean, I worked for a newspaper for 20 years, and I was used to. I mean, and I'm an investigative reporter. I mean, I was used to write these long pieces, and it has been really a challenge to switch and change my mentality because, first of all, there are many different audiences now. We're not writing for the one target that we had in mind in the past. Like I was describing today, how do we tell a story? We tell the story with using 4 different levels of reading. Like, for instance, there is a kind of audience, youth, especially in social networks, social media, that they just want the scoop. I mean, they tell me what do I need to know and how this affect me. That's these people, and that's totally legitimate. I mean, there are many people like that. Our sons, our daughters, many of them, they don't want the whole thing. They don't want details. So you got to do something for them. And we are using video and animation. For instance, the video of no more than 2 minutes that we tell, the basic stuff, and it's viral on the web, and everything works together, because if they want to know more, then they go to the second level, which is the story. I mean, basically, but even the story, I mean, you don't have to tell everything. You can show graphics, again, an interactive application where people can go and see all the information that we used to build to tell the story. And so what we are doing now is that we are putting everything that every document that we had access to. We used to be very arrogant. I mean, nobody can judge our decisions, right? We are journalists. We were owners of the bridge between knowledge and the audience. That's no longer that way. And we need to understand that they need to judge us and our decisions, so that we put up everything, the database available, everything, and they can download and say, and then most of them come back and say, look, you didn't look at this thing, and it was maybe more important than the other one. And it's healthy for us to learn from them and to kind of, and the last, so these 4 levels I see, the last one is the freaks who want to have access to all the database and everything, and then we put it and downloadable, and then they come back to you and they do another visualization of the information or another analysis you never thought about. So it's changing. Everything changed. You cannot keep you can still write beautiful pieces like that. We have to do that plus these other things. I mean, we cannot just keep writing.
Just to add one point to that, which is a great answer, is the web's changed everything, beginning with our business model. So we've had to rethink everything. But I can tell you one thing that happened inside the New York Times is that we began with a website that was once upon a time just a mirror of the print newspaper. So basically, whatever you read in the print paper, you went to the website, you got to read the New York Times in the ether as opposed to on a dead tree. Now, as information has gotten faster and faster, consumers have demanded more and more. We have many more tools, video, graphics, interactive graphics, amazing stuff. One thing in all of that, as there's been a terrific effort to remain constant, and that is to enforce a single standard across the web and into the print media and at the Times. And this is hugely important and very difficult because the pressures are very different. The pressure in the web is on speed. You want to be up there fast. It's almost like the old wire service days, the real old wire service days when everybody would hang out in the courtroom and send signals across the street to announce the verdict in the big murder trial. Is that everybody wants to be fast, but you got to get it right. And so the Times has put a lot of effort into training the people who put up this material to adhere to the same standards that you do in the print media. And of course, that's a difficult thing because if you look at the web as a totality, there's a lot of garbage out there. There's a huge amount of garbage on the internet. And so you have to somehow, we feel that what differentiates the Times is that you're going to preserve the same standard in what you find on the web as you'd find if you bought the paper. So I can do one more question, although Dave's going to throw something at me. So that's the last one.
Thanks for coming, guys. I really wanted to ask Janina, since you mentioned that all these extra elements are now required for the audience to engage with the audience. So on that note, my question is, I'm wondering how much one person should be expected to do as an aspiring journalist. Like, if we're coming out of school, how many different elements should we know?
Everything.
We should know. This is a great question, and that's the reason why I have one of my part of my experience, most of my experience as an investigative journalist. So I'm member of every single international Latin American organization on investigative journalism, and on the other hand, I'm now part of this community of data journalism, also called. And it's so funny. The other day I was in the plane, and I was thinking, look, this is really crazy, because only 3 or 4 members of this community of investigative journalists are also involved in the data journalism world. And the best journalists I know, it's amazing that we are not combining, these two worlds. That's my, and the reason why I've been thinking about, why is this happening? Maybe because of, it's related to your question, maybe because some old-fashioned journalists think that they have to learn all these tools and that it's too late for them. But that's not the case. We don't have to actually, but that's why the teamwork is so important. What we need to know, the basic thing is we need to know how to communicate with them, with the technical people. We need to know, if you don't know that the microwave exists, then you will keep heating your food in the stove. I mean, of course, but you need to know that the microwave was invented. And so it is the same in journalism. You need to know that there is such a thing like, like Google Fusion tables, for instance, that you can take a table and map in seconds, in 2 seconds. You need to know that, you need to know, but you don't need to do everything. That's why my approach is that the teamwork is so important, and multidisciplinary teams working together. And you don't need to spend that much money. I was like a pedophile at the universities trying to find these kids who are graduating, who are graduating with a master's degree in databases, and I was like, hey, can you help me? I mean, they are doing many things for free. As I said, it's happening. They are so excited to work with us. So we need to find the way to communicate with them in the same language. We don't have to become experts at all, or programmers, or I started to learn some languages, but when I understood that, I was overwhelmed. When I understood that I myself, as a person, I couldn't never learn all these things. Multimedia, graphics, editing, video, blah, blah, blah. Then I understood that I had to work with a team, and that was my dream. And I created this team with designers, and it was like heaven. You can't imagine. And you can do it even not within a media organization. You can start building, informal relationships with other disciplines and people.
Mort, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, old dogs don't have to learn new tricks. They just have to know where the young dogs, hide the can opener. That's all.
And in the old days, coming up, it was suggested to us that we choose our discipline. You're going to be print, you're going to be broadcast, or you're going to be, TV or radio. Today, it's everything. In the old days, we used to laugh at Al Franken. The usually dour senator now, in his previous life, was a fantastic comedian, and he had this skit on Saturday Night Live when he was the self-contained, all-purpose journalist, And he'd walk around with a satellite dish on his head, a microphone, and it's strung to a computer. And we used to laugh at that.
Funny now.
We used to laugh at that. And you know what? The BBC reporters who go out in the field now take a broadcast quality audio recording unit with them. They have a small HD camera, and they have sometimes even satellite access to the web, so they can write an online story, they can upload video, and they can prepare audio clips for the BBC World broadcast. It's here. It's now.
That's terrific. Let me just close this by saying that all of that being so, that fundamentally being a journalist is about learning to tell a story and being a good storyteller, which is a skill that transcends all of this in a way. And that's the most important thing. That and a sense of shared standards and a sense, of, I think, of the civic mission of the role of journalism in a free society. That's the essential. Thanks to the panel very much for all of this. Thank you all for coming. Good night.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, thank you. Oh, how sweet of you. Oh, my goodness. Well, bless you. Thank you so much.
Yes.
How are you?
You were terrific, inspiring. Thank you. Absolutely wonderful.
I'm glad to hear that. Sometimes I think I'm, talking to myself so crazy.
Anyway, thank you.